I've been out trying to get the word out about my and Dan Cohen's documentary, Killing Gaza, which really is the culmination of all of our work for the last 3 years on Gaza. And it's a documentary that highlights what it was like when we were inside Gaza during Israel's 51-day assault, what the survivors went through. And, Dan continued filming for a year afterwards, all the way until 2015, when some of the marches began in the no-go zone, which is kind of the area, the 300-meter or so area between what Israel declares as its border with Gaza, where these young men would just start going to the border without the permission of local authorities. That means without Hamas's permission, and in some cases, Hamas would even send the Al-Qassam brigades down to turn them away. But they'd go down every Friday just to protest being under siege, and they'd, wave flags and throw rocks, and they would be shot at with live fire. Sort of a small-scale version of what we saw on May 15th, where Israel massacred something like 62 people. And Dan was there. You can see this in our documentary, Killing Gaza. People were shot in the foot. They were shot in the leg. They were shot in the chest, and they were shot in the head. And I think 9 people died in that particular demonstration. So I guess, Ali, what we hear a lot from the Israeli side about like Hamas, which we expect. But we see that talking point conveyed. There's sort of a sense even in, mainstream accounts, not just pro-Israel Hasbara accounts, that, Hamas at least encouraged this, that they've cultivated the atmosphere for these protests, that they're not just providing infrastructure, but, they're down there pushing people to go and get shot. How do you respond to that? And what do you think the factors are behind these demonstrations?
I actually think a good place to start is to say that Killing Gaza, the documentary that you and Dan made, is, the timing couldn't have been more appropriate, because it comes out at a time when we have these mega distortions in the media trying to dehumanize Palestinians. And that film is one of the most powerful I've seen, that just shows people in Gaza trying to live their lives, trying to make art, trying to feed their families, facing incredible levels of trauma. And what is happening now, connects back directly to the 2014 Israeli assault, in the sense that on May 14th this year, when Israel massacred more than 60 Palestinians at the Gaza-Israel boundary, unarmed Palestinians, and injured more than 1,000. The doctors at Al-Shifa Hospital, and in fact all the hospitals in Gaza, say that May 14th was worse than any single day in the 2014 war, when they were bombing with F-16s and missiles and I don't know what. That's the scale of what's happening in Gaza now. And why are people going to the border? They're going because they are under a medieval siege, where the basic deal Israel is offering Palestinians is die quietly or we'll shoot you. And what do I mean by that is, you take just the year 2017, 54 Palestinians died in Gaza waiting for permits to be allowed out of this ghetto by Israel for medical treatment they couldn't get in Gaza. Most of them were cancer patients, and they died. In the same year, 2017, that the number of medical permits Israel issued hit the lowest level since statistics were recorded. So that's the deal. You die quietly, or if you protest, we'll shoot you dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually in Gaza earlier this year, doing a freelance production job for Anya Parampil, who was doing a series of specials for RT America. And we got to meet one of those, the family of one of those people, who had been a cook actually at Tel Aviv University, had spent his entire career working inside Israel, retired in Gaza, then fell under siege, developed cancer, they told his family in Gaza at Al-Shifa that it was inoperable and he would need to, it wasn't inoperable, but he would need an operation they could not perform, and he would need to get it in Jerusalem. And his permit was delayed and delayed and delayed, and it never came. And his family showed us video of him on his deathbed dying slowly because he couldn't get out to receive treatment for what could have been operable. So those are the kind of people who have been confronting the siege. I mean, you go from family to family, house to house in the Gaza Strip, and you meet people like that who have been scarred by the siege in one way or another. And actually, the home that we interviewed them in had been bombed and destroyed in the 51-day war, and it was one of the homes that had been rebuilt. So at every level, this family had just been completely seared by Israel's slaughter and siege policy. So yeah, you're right. There is a very stark choice that people on the Gaza Strip have to make.
And they've decided they don't want to die quietly. Now, this question about, oh, it's all Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Well, you know, people in Gaza, this is all about, this Israeli line about Hamas, Hamas is about erasing people's agency. It's about saying that Palestinians are not autonomous, they can't organize, they don't have the same concerns and desires and yearnings as other people. But okay, suppose it's true. What does it tell us? It tells us that Hamas's political strategy is changing. The fact that Hamas has embraced mass civilian protests, why would that be a bad thing? Now, just about a year ago in May, Hamas issued a new charter where they talked about their political transformation. Really, that charter was an enunciation of political positions they'd held for a number of years, but they put it in one document. Number one, they renounced clearly or stated very clearly any notion that the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis is religious. They say we're not against the Jewish religion or Jewish people. We fight the Zionists, we fight Israel because they're colonizing and occupying us. So a clear enunciation of the anti-colonial nature of this struggle. The second thing they say is that we believe resistance is a right for any occupied people, but it's up to Palestinians to decide how to exercise that resistance, and they may choose different means even while not renouncing the right to resistance. And by the way, that was exactly the position Mandela took, which is that we may or may not choose armed resistance, but we have the right. And so if we see Hamas here embracing different strategies, why would that be a bad thing? We've had Thomas Friedman, we've had all these liberals telling us for years, oh, Palestinians should embrace the tactics of Gandhi. Well, why wouldn't you welcome it? Why wouldn't you welcome it if that's what was happening?
Well, you know, these are not Gandhian tactics in the minds of many, pro-Israel pundits or even liberals, because we see the deployment of flaming kites, which are now being deemed an existential threat to Israel. Gaza's using these kites. People in Gaza are using these kites with incendiary devices attached to them. And it's like, you know, they're not using rockets. They're not using guns. There's no suicide bombings taking place. But the reaction to flaming kites is the same. Israel is seeking to develop anti-kite systems, and actually, I think a few days ago, during a protest outside Khan Yunis, south of, to the southeast of Gaza, Israel attacked a pile of tires with a drone. They actually literally bombed tires with a drone to prevent the protesters from using flaming tires.
You know, Palestinians have a name for the flaming tires, which they started lighting up to create a smoke screen to stop the Israeli snipers from picking off children. They've killed 15 children since the Great March of Return, and other unarmed civilians. They call it Tire Dome.
Yeah, which is a reference to Israel's Iron Dome, which is its anti-rocket system.
And also, by the way, the Palestinians brought down an Israeli drone just a few days ago with a kite flying a fishnet behind it. And this is, you know, you watch the videos and people are ecstatically joyous about this, because here they are with a kite and a fishnet bringing down this expensive Israeli high technology. But what is critical about that is that Israel uses Gaza as a showcase to market these technologies around the world. And it's really bad for Israel's branding and marketing to see that these technologies that they sell as, oh, these are the solution to the poor people in your favelas that are going to rise up, or these are the solution to the people who are going to protest against your oligarchs, are actually worthless. And people are able to defeat them. So it's significant in that sense, too.
I just had heard, that there was at a recent international weapons fair, Israel had introduced new technology to block the sun from reaching Gaza. But that's sort of off the record. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and let's talk more about the specific tactics that the Israeli military is using against these protesters. Specifically, it's pretty clear that the Israeli military is trying to maim and disable as many Palestinians as possible. And I don't think this is getting much coverage in the media. There's focus on the deaths, but as I mentioned, thousands of people have been shot. And speaking of experimental military technology, Israel is using exploding bullets and other kinds of ammunition, and the Israeli snipers are intentionally targeting, it seems like legs, also genitals, like parts of the body that if you were wounded in would impair you for the rest of your life and would make your life hellish.
Yeah, and the last thing I said was a joke, but Israel actually is using the tear gas drone, and I expect that to be seen in a city near us.
This issue of the maiming is really important because it is a deliberate strategy. And the doctors who are in Gaza, the Palestinian doctors, but also the international groups like Medical Aid for Palestinians and Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross, have all documented the horrific nature of these injuries. These are not normal bullet wounds. You know, a bullet goes into a limb and comes out the other side, and it might break a bone. That's bad enough. But what these Israeli bullets do is they fragment and they pulverize the bone and the muscle, so there's nothing left. And so limbs have to be amputated. So dozens or hundreds have already lost their limbs, and others will live with lifelong injuries. There was the young Palestinian footballer Mohammed Khalil Abeid, who actually filmed himself. He was doing a selfie video. He was hundreds of meters, you can see this in the video, hundreds of meters away from the boundary fence, and he's just taking a selfie, just kind of like, look where I am, and they shoot his kneecaps off. It's horrifying to watch. They shoot his kneecaps off, ending his promising football career. He was a marathon runner who had won a marathon the previous year in Gaza. And so that's just one example. But also the documentary evidence that has been collected by Palestinians, by human rights groups, shows that contrary to the Israeli claims, the people who are being shot are often running away, hundreds of meters away from the fence. They pose no conceivable threat whatsoever. This is just shooting fish in a barrel, so to speak. And we know it's deliberate because we've had, for example, the Israeli general Zvika Fogel going on Israeli radio and explaining very clearly that these bullets that kill children or kill nurses like Razan Najjar or journalists like Yasser Murtaja are not stray bullets. They are, he described the particular procedures where you have to get permission, you have to aim, the target is marked by a superior officer, then you get permission to fire. And the interviewer on the Israeli public radio asked, well, you know, anyone who comes close to the fence, their sentence is death, even if they're a child. And Zvika Fogel answered, yes, basically. And, you know, it's very unfortunate. Sometimes when you aim at a small body, the small body of a child, and you're aiming a little lower and whoops, the bullet goes a bit higher and you hit their head. This was on Israeli public radio. It is utterly horrifying. And it's something that Israel is doing. This is important. Openly. They're not hiding that they're doing this. They say it openly. The question is, why is there so little reaction to it?
Yeah, and then early on in the massacre, on the official IDF spokesperson Twitter account, they tweeted a thread, which they later deleted, but they tweeted the exact phrase, quote, "We know where every bullet landed." And they were boasting of that. They were boasting that they knew exactly where they were shooting. And of course, they were shooting civilians.
And yes, they certainly removed that because that would have been very useful evidence for international prosecutors. It was evidence of intent and premeditation and full knowledge of what they're doing. You have to remember that on, I think it was the 9th of April, so about 10 days after the first massacre happened on March 30th, the International Court prosecutor issued an unprecedented public warning to Israeli leaders that the ICC was watching and they could face trial for war crimes because of these ongoing shootings. We'll have to see whether that ever happens. The International Criminal Court does not have a great record, but it was nonetheless unprecedented that the ICC issued this warning because the Israeli behavior and the statements about it were so blatant that I think the ICC thought it would lose any credibility if it just, didn't say anything at all.
And the Israeli Supreme Court has refused a challenge to the open fire policy, am I right?
That's right. The Israeli Supreme Court, which is held up in this country as this great liberal institution, has an unbroken history of blessing every illegal criminal behavior that the Israeli military occupation and secret police have taken out against Palestinians for decades, from torture to punitive home demolitions to detention without charge or trial for years on end. You name it. The Israeli High Court has blessed it, but this is the same High Court that our liberal nominees for the Supreme Court have to say before the Senate, "Oh, I really admire the Israeli Supreme Court," to prove their bona fides to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. I think Elena Kagan had to do that, and there have been others who have said how wonderful the Israeli court is.
Yes, Elena Kagan has said that her mentor was the former Chief Justice of the Israeli High Court, Aharon Barak, who was himself involved in providing cover to occupation under, liberal legal guise. And, that wasn't a problem for her. She actually declared in her confirmation hearings that Barak was her guide as a means of currying support with both parties.
It's kind of like how Barack Obama compared Shimon Peres, the lifelong war criminal, to Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, there's a clear one-in-one comparison. Speaking of impunity, I mean, Barack Obama could praise Perez and, get away with it. Barack Obama could be the biggest supporter or preside over the worst, what you could call disproportionate Israeli violence in history. 3 catastrophic wars against Gaza, 2 directly under Obama's watch, 1 while Obama's being briefed as he's about to enter the White House. But now the mask is off. Donald Trump is president. Nikki Haley's at the UN, and her job is to provide Israel with total impunity to carry out these massacres. And, she's suddenly become, I saw a Rasmussen poll before the Great March of Return happened that showed that she was the most popular figure in the Trump administration. And I remember, after the Khan Sheikhoun attack, which was said to be a chemical attack in Syria, Nikki Haley was the darling of mainstream corporate media, holding up pictures of dead children in Syria. Now she's trying to cover up pictures of dead people in Gaza, and her sheen is wearing off. She was heckled at the University of Houston in a speech continuously. And she has been seen begging on the floor of the UN at the Security Council for someone to support her. And not one country would support her in trying to resist or provide a kind of counter resolution to the Kuwaiti resolution calling for the protection of these protesters in Gaza.
Also, she was, to stress this, she was literally begging. There's video of her on her knees begging other countries.
Well, and that's such a contrast with what she said when she was first nominated, because she said she would be beating people with her high heels. I guess she didn't do that in the end.
Yeah, there was no beating with high heels. She's threatened countries. She basically said either you're with us or you're against us, threatening to withhold UN funding, threatening to withhold US aid to these countries, and they won't budge. Even the UK abstained on Nikki Haley's resolution blaming Hamas. So, I mean, where do you think these protests are taking Israel in the diplomatic realm, and how are they exposing the special relationship?
That's an interesting question, because it's clear Israel's stock internationally is plummeting, and this is certainly true at the popular level and in terms of pop culture, where we've seen massive, major leaps in support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We saw Gilberto Gil cancel his show in Tel Aviv. Shakira did the same. We saw dozens, if not hundreds, of independent UK bands and artists announcing in a coordinated action their adherence to the Palestinian cultural boycott call. And the biggest one of all was the Argentina national football team canceling the match that was the so-called friendly match it was supposed to hold in Jerusalem. That was a massive blow to Israel, and it came despite enormous Israeli diplomatic efforts and bullying and threats to get that game to go ahead. And but at the level of European governments, we've seen this kind of a recognition of the need to say something to appease the horrified public opinion. So we've seen kind of light criticisms of Israel, but the European governments continue their Trump-like embrace of Israel in practice. But I would say there's an interesting thing on the US political scene. I've been tracking this very closely. While I don't want to claim that our Congress is our profiles in courage. There have been very few members of Congress who have openly criticized Israel, though some have, and some have done so very strongly. What I think is maybe a more telling indicator is how few defended Israel. And I'm not just talking about Democrats, Republicans. I think you can count on one hand, maybe less than one hand, the number of Republicans who came out to defend what Israel has been doing in Gaza. In fact, more members of Congress have criticized Israel than defended it, but the vast majority have stayed silent. Notice you have seen no resolutions in Congress, as you usually do, backing what Israel is doing. You have seen no letters circulated by AIPAC with 80 or 90 signatures from the Senate saying, yes, we support Israel shooting unarmed people in Gaza. I think that's where the real leading indicator is. It's not so much the amount of opposition, it's the unwillingness even of Republicans to stand up and defend this. That says something.
Yeah, and then what do you think about Bernie Sanders? Clearly, we saw during his presidential campaign in 2016, I mean, he did speak out a little bit. It was mostly pretty tepid. He always qualified his language, but compared to other politicians, it was pretty significant, especially compared to Hillary Clinton, his primary opponent at the time. And even since then, he's actually gotten worse. He's made some statements in the past few years on Palestine that have been pretty bad, but it seems like since the Great March of Return, which began on March 30th, that's what we're talking about, since the Great March of Return began, the Bernie Sanders campaign, at least his team, through his Twitter account and social media, they've been releasing some pretty good videos. What do you think of his statements since then?
Bernie Sanders has been all over the place on Palestine and continues to be. And, at the Electronic Intifada, we've published a lot about that going back to the 2016 campaign. And he's made some great statements and some terrible statements. And he also took a position against BDS. But you're right, the more recent stuff highlighting Gaza is good to see. the way I take it is not so much, Bernie Sanders is great or Bernie Sanders is doing a great thing, but Bernie Sanders seeing and understanding the need to respond to the grassroots horror at what Israel is doing, and that is a constituency that someone needs to speak for and address. So I see it as a response to that grassroots pressure, and we shouldn't really spend a lot of time arguing about whether Bernie Sanders said exactly the right thing in exactly the right way, but rather to see that there is a movement in a better direction as a result of grassroots pressure, and we should take that as a signal that grassroots pressure should continue on Bernie Sanders and on other so-called progressive politicians, among them Elizabeth Warren and others.
Absolutely. And I think, we will see to some extent, and certainly for the first time in a Democratic primary, Palestine becoming an issue, and you'll see a divide between the Bernie Democrats, if you can call them Democrats, the Elizabeth Warren Democrats. I think Elizabeth Warren is going to issue some criticism. It might just be purely symbolic of Israeli actions. And we've seen her kind of move away from having AIPAC write the foreign policy script on her website to saying some things, to diverging slightly from the Washington consensus, kind of getting a sense of which way the wind is blowing. And then on the other side, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, who said that as a kid she went out and raised money for the ethnic cleansing organization known as the Jewish National Fund, covering up their support for Israel with appeals to liberal social justice on other issues. And this divide is going to play out in a really clear way where Kamala Harris and Cory Booker will be supported with Wall Street money as well as pro-Israel money. And you'll see a greater fracturing of the Democratic Party base, or a continuation of the process in 2016. The question is, what can be done to encourage that fracturing, which I think is actually could be a positive development. And I wonder if either of you have any suggestions or ideas.
What we've seen in a lot of the opinion surveys of the Democratic base over time in recent years is that fracturing is very real. The shift away from support for Israel and towards more sympathy for Palestinians and understanding of the need for justice for Palestinians, and that this is a general social and societal trend, but it is very much a generational trend. And you see that playing out within the Democratic Party, where young activists, many of them Jewish activists, are the ones who are taking the fight literally to the doors of the Dianne Feinsteins and the Chuck Schumers and demanding that they speak out. So I think this is going to play out very much as a generational battle as well.
And, Senator for Life Dianne Feinstein has even called for a UN investigation into the Israeli massacres in Gaza. I mean, I was blown away. A UN investigation. In the past, you had Obama say, we'll look forward to an independent investigation. Look, Israel will investigate itself. It'll be good. Everyone will be happy. We'll move on to the next massacre.
Yeah, and I can't even think of a time when a U.S. senator, let alone someone like Dianne Feinstein, who has been such a reliable AIPAC vote over so many decades, has actually called for a UN investigation. Again, this isn't about credit to Dianne Feinstein. This is about a shrewd politician starting to see which way the wind is blowing.